At this point, a small comment is, unfortunately, a necessity. Like the great flood, Jonah and the whale, literally great fish, and the parting of the Red Sea, this is one of those portions of Scripture that, for some reason or other, offends the sensibilities of sometime readers of Scripture more than other biblical descriptions of supernatural activity. Why this should be so is entirely unclear to the writer, for the Bible is a supernatural book. Virtually every verse reflects the hand of the ultimate spiritual, supernatural, non-material God of the universe upon the material world our eyes can see. The events depicted in Genesis chapter 6 happened. We know they did, because the Bible clearly relates that they did. The text of the chapter is quite clear about the facts, in spite of enthusiastic efforts on the part of some to explain them away. And if there were any doubt, we also possess several New Testament passages that discuss this matter more or less directly, and make it almost impossible to interpret Genesis 6 in any other way than is suggested here. 1 Peter 3:19 and 20, 2 Peter 2, 4 through 9, and Jude 5 through 7. Thus, the angelic cohabitation interpretation of Genesis 6 not only found favor in the early church, refuting it requires the untenable position that two of the inspired New Testament writers either got it wrong or were indulging in allegory. Genesis 6, 1 and 2, Angelic Cohabitation. Now it came to pass that when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, that is, the fallen angels, noticed the daughters of men, that they were beautiful. So they took wives for themselves from all whom they selected. Genesis 6, 1 and 2. To return to our theme, the time frame for the events of Genesis chapter 6, as mentioned, is roughly the first third of the Gentile age's second millennial day, that is, the final days of the post-Edenic generation. As this passage indicates, it was a time of rapidly increasing population growth, with the new inhabitants now separated from the fall and the prophecies to Adam and Eve by many years and many generations. It was also a time of little spirituality outside of the direct line of Seth, a circumstance which was to provide the devil with his opportunity for attack. First of all, the phrase "sons of God" mentioned here most definitely refers to angels. This is so despite elaborate attempts to otherwise construe this passage on the part of those who have found the clear meaning uncomfortable, due to the bias against the existence of all things supernatural alluded to at the opening of this section. For one thing, we cannot assume that only daughters were born to mankind, for obviously enough, male and female offspring would be necessary for the population expansion here described. No, the daughters are singled out because they become the objects of the attentions of the sons of God, that is, fallen angels, mentioned next. For it is the female who carries the essential seed of our humanity, witness the virgin birth, and was, therefore, the natural target of this satanic operation. Even more convincing is the fact that everywhere else in Scripture the phrase Bene ha-Elohim, sons of God, and its variants refer not to men, but to angels, Job 1, 6, 2, 1, 38, 7, Anathrus, Psalm 29, 1, and Psalm 89, 6, Bene Elim. Finally, as we have mentioned, there are 3 New Testament passages which reference the events of Genesis chapter 6, and all 3 clearly link fallen angels to the activities here described. It was also by means of the Spirit that Christ visited the angelic spirits in prison, that is, in the abyss, and proclaimed his victory. These are the angels who were disobedient in the days of Noah at the time when God patiently waited, that is, delayed judgment, while the ark was being built. 1 Peter 3:19 and 20. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but plunged them into Tartarus with its gloomy pits, that is, the abyss, preserving them for the day of judgment, and did not spare the antediluvian world, but kept safe Noah as a proclaimer of righteousness, and the 7 with him when he brought the flood upon the ungodly inhabitants of the world, and condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction, reducing them to ashes, and making them an example to those bent on similar ungodly. behavior and rescued righteous Lot, who was tormented by the depraved lifestyle of those lawless men. For through the things he saw and heard, just by dwelling among them, this righteous man was damaging his righteous way of life day by day on account of their lawless deeds. For the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, especially those who in their lust pursue the polluting of the flesh, and so despise God's divine authority. 2 Peter 2, 4-10. Although you know all these things, I want to remind you that though the Lord saved all his people from the land of Egypt at the first, in the end he destroyed those who proved unfaithful, and the angels who did not keep to their own realm, but deserted their proper habitation. He is imprisoned with everlasting chains in the gloom below, that is, in the abyss, in anticipation of the judgment of that great day, just as he did with Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighboring cities, for they all prostituted themselves in the same manner as these angels did, having pursued sexual relations, literally flesh, that were inappropriate for them, that is, outside of the natural order. And so it is that they have been appointed an example and incurred the penalty of eternal fire. Jude 5-7. Note that all three New Testament passages make reference to the imprisonment of fallen angels in the abyss on account of their activities just prior to the Great Flood. Moreover, the second two, 2 Peter 2, 4-10 and Jude 5-7, clearly connect this activity with illicit sexual behavior comparable in its outrageousness, though not identical, obviously, in its specifics, to that practiced in Sodom and Gomorrah. Finally, the third passage, Jude 5-7, is quite specific in stating that this intermarriage of fallen angels with willing human women constituted an unauthorized abandonment of the rightful angelic sphere, one reason for the severe temporary judgment inflicted upon the perpetrators of these acts. It is hoped that the primary objection to the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6, namely its so-called oddity, will have been removed by the broader context supplied by this study. For, in a vacuum, angelic cohabitation with human woman may seem unlikely as well as bizarre. In the context of the devil's strategy to resist God's plan in every conceivable way, however, the enlistment of some of his more reckless followers to pollute, and thereby effectively destroy, the human race contains a certain cold logic. This is especially true when considers that the success of this operation would have removed the possibility of God's eventual carrying out of the judgment already proclaimed against the devil, because it would have made the birth of the promised Messiah, the woman's pure human seed, an impossibility. Genesis 6, 1 and 2, quoted at the beginning of this section, leaves unstated the obvious background to these events. Rapid expansion of the human race brought with it an increased carelessness about acknowledging, let alone following, God and his natural law. Of this we may be sure, for it is just this expanding depravity of human behavior, seen here on earth for the first, though certainly not the last, time that forms the basis for a divine displeasure so extreme that the great flood becomes the only acceptable remedy. Genesis 6, 5-8 and 6:11-13. These conditions provided Satan with his first major strategic opportunity since his success in corrupting Adam and Eve. Apparently prohibited from direct, outright destruction of human beings, otherwise he would long ago have taken this obvious remedy, and stymied in his abortive attempt to have human beings slaughter each other to the point of extinction. By God's prohibition of murder in the wake of Cain's killing of Abel, he now found himself confronted with the intriguing prospect of introducing a fatal disease, so to speak, among the growing ranks of the spiritually weak. If he were not allowed to give such a disease to humanity, and thus destroy us apart from our free will, he discerned that granting an opportunity to contract such a disease would be a different matter. Offering the possibility of cohabitation with some of his followers would be an attractive portion of leaven that would soon leaven the whole lump. To abide by the principle of preserving human free will in the unseen conflict that rages around us, It would only be necessary to make these initial liaisons voluntary. The diabolical beauty of the plan was that this seed, once planted, would quickly spread. Although the majority might refuse such abominable joining in the first place, there would be some who would accept or even seek such alliances given the talented offspring that would be produced. And the situation would ever be such that a refusal would only be a temporary win for humanity, while an acceptance would be a permanent loss. Once the angelic seed was introduced into the human gene pool, sooner or later every human family would become infected and spread that infection, always by choice, until at last there would be no possibility of a pure line for the Messiah,